Thank you. We are continuing our survey of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is divided into four groups of books: the Pentateuch, the books of history, the books of poetry, and the books of prophecy. We've already examined the first three: the Pentateuch, the books of history, the books of poetry. We're working our way now through the books of prophecy. All the books of prophecy were written by men who lived and wrote after the time of the divided kingdom. And these books of prophecy are divided into three groups: the pre-exilic prophets, the exilic prophets, those are the prophets who lived prior to or during the time of the Babylonian captivity, and then the post-exilic prophets. These are the three prophets who lived after the time of the Babylonian captivity. There are three prophets who are post-exilic: Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi. Haggai and Zechariah were raised up by God to push the people of Israel to build the temple. They returned from the Babylonian captivity around 538, 537. They built an altar, they laid the foundation for the temple, and then they stopped building in 535. And for the next 15 years they didn't build. So in 520 BC, God raised up Haggai and Zechariah, and these two prophets urged the people to rebuild the temple, which the people did, and it was completed in 516 BC. The third and last of our post-exilic prophets, and the last of the books of prophecy, and the last book in the Old Testament, this wraps up our survey of the Old Testament, is Malachi. Malachi was a prophet who lived roughly 75 to 80 years after the children of Israel returned from the Babylonian captivity. We don't know exactly when he wrote. If you think about 450 BC, maybe 400 BC, maybe a little bit before 450 BC, sometime in there. Think about Isaiah or Nehemiah. Remember, in 444 BC, was instrumental in helping the children of Israel build the wall around Jerusalem. Malachi may have prophesied a little bit before that or a little bit after that, sometime around 450 BC, plus or minus a few years. Malachi was raised up because the children of Israel were going spiritually apathetic. Things were pretty good. They've been back roughly 100 years, 75 to 100 years. They've been back in Israel, even though most of the men and women remained in captivity. They didn't have to remain in captivity, but they remained in Mesopotamia and in Persia. They came back to Israel. Things were doing well in many respects. They had rebuilt the temple. They rebuilt Jerusalem. They rebuilt the wall around Jerusalem. They were sort of developing themselves as a nation again. But they became apathetic, spiritually apathetic. They just sort of lost interest, like religious people do, like Christians do. People become apathetic. I'm still running into people I knew 30 or 40 years ago who were zealous for the Lord, and they're not so zealous anymore. And that, unfortunately, is a curse that we fall into. And the children of Israel were growing apathetic. They even were growing contemptuous of God. And what was happening was this: out of their apathy, they weren't tithing the way they were supposed to. They weren't offering good sacrifices. They were actually offering diseased animals. So some people had abandoned the faith altogether, but these people hadn't abandoned the faith. They were still sort of practicing Judaism, but they were apathetic. Faulty sacrifices, not tithing, and as a result, God was punishing them, not severely, but their crops weren't as abundant, their flocks and their herds weren't as large, and the people looked at that lack of prosperity and said, God doesn't love us anymore. When in fact, God loved them a great deal. The problem was they were growing spiritually apathetic, and God was trying to get their attention. And this happens. Well, it happens to us. How many times have you known Christian families who, when problems come into their lives, they abandon the faith? God doesn't love me anymore. My wife left me. My son left me. I lost my job. It's very easy when problems come into our lives to say, God doesn't love me anymore. And so that was sort of the situation that was going on in Israel at the time. Things, were better than they had been. The temple had been built. People were using it. The priests were functioning. The city had its wall around. It was a sort of a thriving nation, still under Persian rule, but the Persians allowed them a certain amount of autonomy. And but they were going spiritually apathetic, so God raised up Malachi to push the people to do better. With that little bit of introduction, let's go to the memory aid is storehouse. Storehouse because Malachi is going to be talking to the children of Israel about bringing their tithes into the storehouse of the Lord. So that's one of the minor themes in this book, and so that's our memory aid for Malachi. PowerPoint. 100 years after their return, the Israelites were doing better. The city of Jerusalem and the temple had been rebuilt. After 1,000 years of idolatry, the nation was finally cured. And they were. There were individuals who were idolatrous. But one thing the Babylonian captivity did effectively, and that was cure them of the nation as a whole of idolatry. So there were a lot of reasons to be encouraged. Unfortunately, people were growing spiritually apathetic and contemptuous of God. This was made evident, as I pointed out, in inferior sacrifices, neglecting to give God their tithes. And there was another problem. They were refusing to follow God's demands about marriage and divorce. When the children of Israel went into the land of Canaan, God said, don't marry the Canaanites. The problem is this. You marry a Canaanite man or a Canaanite woman, and you marry his or her God. That's just unfortunately the way the system works. And they were starting, not a lot of them perhaps, but many of them were starting to marry Canaanites. And with that came the Canaanite gods would move into the home. Now, the children of Israel really, as a nation, never fell back into idolatry, but if they continued this, they might easily fall into it. And this doesn't mean, however, that an Israelite couldn't marry a Canaanite or a Gentile. Rahab and Ruth are examples of two wonderful, godly Canaanites who were married by Jewish men, and God honored them. In fact, he speaks eloquently about them, very complimentary ways about them. But they became Jews. There was a way you could marry a Gentile. If the Gentile converted to Judaism, he was actually, or she would actually be considered a Jew. It isn't just that you embrace Judaism, they treated you as a Jew, they thought of you as a Jew. So if there was a Canaanite who embraced the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and converted to Judaism, there was a sense in which he or she would be viewed as a Jew. So you could marry one of those, but that's a different situation than marrying a Canaanite who's still worshiping his or her Canaanite deity. And the children of Israel were doing the latter. They were refusing to follow God's demands about marriage and also about divorce. What was happening? These guys were doing what piggy men do. They were dumping their wives when they got old so they could marry a younger and more attractive one. Now, you say, why did you put it that way? Because that's exactly what the deal is. Let's don't dance around the subject. There's a lot of, and this actually is a problem that Jews seem to have a lot. Jesus spoke about essentially the same thing when he was on earth. They had a terrible habit of getting married when the wife gets older, then divorcing her to marry someone younger, which was a horrible thing to do. Horrible. And God was not happy with them. So there were a number of reasons why, or a number of ways in which they were expressing their spiritual apathy. They were offering inferior sacrifices, they were neglecting to give God their tithes, and they were refusing to follow God's demands about marriage. They were marrying Canaanite women who had not converted to Judaism, and they were divorcing. Guys were divorcing their wives when their wives got older so they could marry younger girls. And then often that meant that the woman was destitute. And she might have her family, might still be alive that would take care of her, but you don't have a social welfare net. So when that happened, not only it was an offense to God because it was just flat out wrong, but these women then would often be destitute. And that was a horrible thing to do, and God didn't like it one bit. So anyway, he raises up Malachi to chastise the people, which is my third point. Now, we're unsure, as I pointed out, about the date of the writing. It may have been around 460 BC. It could have been 430 BC or a little later. Think about the building of the wall a little bit before, a little after. I have mental ways I keep up with some of this stuff. I think of Nehemiah rebuilding the wall in 444 BC. Could be a little bit before that Malachi wrote his book, or a little bit afterwards. All right, now the three important issues in the book of Malachi. Israel, first issue was Israel had foolishly doubted God's love. As I pointed out a moment ago, they had grown spiritually apathetic, even contemptuous of God, and God had withdrawn some of his blessings so that their crops weren't as abundant, their herds and their flocks weren't as large, and they said, well, God just doesn't love us anymore, which wasn't the case at all. And then they were, as I pointed out, guilty of spiritual apathy and contempt for God. And then the third issue that is raised in the book of Malachi is the coming of John the Baptist. Only he doesn't say John the Baptist. He speaks about one who will come to prepare the way for the Messiah. Well, I just pointed out that individual was John the Baptist because that's what we all know about. All right, let's deal with the first of those three issues. Israel had foolishly doubted God's love. Apparently, as I pointed out, the prosperity of Israel had declined. Israel reacted by questioning God's love for them. Their prosperity declined not because God no longer loved them, but because they were backslidden. Israel was guilty of spiritual apathy and contempt for God, and God was withdrawing some of his blessings. God responded to their concern about his love for them by saying, I love you. And their response was, prove it. Really? That shows that's the contempt we're talking about, folks. That isn't just apathy, that's contempt. Israelites wanted God to prove that he loved them. And Malachi records this little bit of information. An oracle, the word of the Lord to Israel through Malachi. I have loved you, says the Lord. They question his love. He says, I've loved you. But you ask, how have you loved us? Prove it. God then reminded them, sort of indirectly, he was trying to point out how he had loved them. And he reminded them of his love for Jacob and his hatred of Esau. Now, 1,500 years before Malachi wrote his book, there were two brothers. One was Jacob, one was Esau. God said, Jacob I loved, Esau I've hated. Jacob is your father. These Israelites were all descendants of Jacob. The Edomites were descendants of Esau. And he says, basically, look at your land. Look at the land of the descendants of Jacob. Look at the land of the descendants of Esau. The land of the descendants of Jacob is rich and plentiful, your land. The land of the descendants of Esau, the land of Edomites, is a wasteland. He's sort of saying, you wanted me to point out something tangible to show you how much I loved you? Well, Esau I hated. If I hated you, you'd be like Esau. That's indirectly what he's saying. If I really hated you, had no love for you, your land would be a wasteland like his. But it isn't. It's fruitful. Your herds, they may be a little diminished because of your spiritual apathy, but you're blessed. Let's read. To prove that he loved him, God reminded them that he loved Jacob, from whom they were descended. He hated Esau, from whom the Edomites were descended. And Edom was a wasteland, and Israel is not. Let's read the passage in verses 2 and 3. Was not Esau Jacob's brother, the Lord says? Yet I have loved Jacob, but Esau I have hated, and have turned his mountains into a wasteland, and left his inheritance to the desert jackals. Israel doubted God's love. God says, I love you. The Israelites say, prove it. God says, look at the descendants of Jacob and Esau. And there's tangible proof. You I love, Esau I don't love. Continuing, Wiersbe wrote, I have loved you, God says to his people. Oh, they responded, how have you loved, how has your love, I can't read. I guess I'm reverting back to childhood when I learned to. I have loved you, God says to his people. Oh, they respond, how have you loved us? This is the problem. How have you loved us? That's not how have you loved us? Prove it. Doubting God's love is the beginning of unbelief and disobedience. Eve doubted God's love and ate of the forbidden tree. She thought God was holding out on her. Satan wants us to feel neglected by God. Look at your difficult circumstances, he said to the Jewish remnant. Where are the crops? Why doesn't God take care of you? God was taking very good care of them. He was reducing the abundance a bit because he was trying to shape them up. But we have the same problem. I've seen this in Christendom my whole life. A few problems come, and I've seen them just completely walk away from the faith. Completely walk away from the faith. And there are times when I'm not sure why God allowed problems to come into my life. And I have to watch it because it's very easy to get angry and bitter. Because sometimes the problems that come in our lives can be very, very severe. And I understand that. You have to be very careful that you don't start questioning God's love because problems come. And that was, of course, their case, their problem. 3 important issues raised in the book of Malachi. Israel had foolishly doubted God's love. And he said, but I have loved you. They said, prove it. And he did. Second point, issue. Israel was guilty of spiritual apathy and contempt for God. The dominant issue, and this really is sort of the dominant issue in the book of Malachi. These sins characterize the priests. These sins characterize the people. Malachi chapter 1, verse 6. A son honors his father and a servant his master. If I am a father, where is the honor due me? If I am a master, where is the respect due me, says the Lord Almighty. It is you, O priests, who show contempt for my name. One of the problems was that the priests, the citizenry was apathetic and contemptuous of God, but the priests were allowing that. They had the same attitude. They should never have allowed anyone to come with a sacrifice that was flawed. But they were saying they were spiritually apathetic. It was sort of like, who cares? What the heck? Just throw it on. Even if it's a lame lamb, throw it on. If it's a blind with a disease, throw it on the altar. This was a terrible attitude. There were a number of ways, and he'll point out about 5 different ways in which the Israelites showed contempt for God. First, they offered diseased animals as sacrifices. God gave us his best. He expects us to give him our best. And keep in mind that most of these sacrifices were examples of the ultimate sacrifice, Jesus Christ. All of these sacrifices look forward to the ultimate sacrifice for our sin, Jesus Christ, which was God's very best, and he was perfect. And so when God said, I want you to give me your best, he wanted that because our sacrifices were supposed to be examples of the ultimate sacrifice, the perfect Jesus Christ. And when they were giving diseased ones, it blew the symbolism. And it was also showing contempt for God. We don't care what you think. He gives us his best. He expects us to give him our best. And he expected them to give their very best animals. He still does. He expects us to give his best. When we do Christian work, I've been around Christendom now 45 years. And I found that most Christian workers do good work. They do the best they can do. You can't do better than what you are. But most do a good work. But every so often you find folks who just do a terrible job. I remember I was going to a dinner party one Saturday. Must have been 30 years ago. And it was a Saturday afternoon. And there was a pastor there. And it was 3 in the afternoon. He says, boy, I got to leave. I got to put something together for tomorrow. And I thought, I can't believe you, man. Well, it wasn't a big, important church. It was a small church. So what? So what? You should start them on Monday. But I couldn't believe it. It's 3 o'clock. I got to get home to put something together. So he threw something together in just a few hours. That's not the way we're supposed to serve the Lord. We're supposed to give him our best. So, well, it's only a Sunday school class. So what? So what? It's a small church. So what? He wouldn't have done that for a church if the church had been a church of 2,000. But because it was small, he just didn't care. Now, most aren't that way. I'll say this. I've known a lot of pastors over the years. Most genuinely love the Lord. They genuinely love their congregations, and they want to do as good a job as they possibly can. But every so often, you run into people who just don't. And what God is saying here is, when you give me your sacrifices, give me your best. Give me your best. Even if the Sunday school class has 3 people in it, so what? Give it your best. They were not giving God his best. Malachi chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. But you ask, how have we shown contempt for your name? When they gave disease sacrifices, they were showing contempt for God. And we do a lousy job I'm not talking about suggesting that because you don't have the talent to do a better job. I'm talking about when you don't really give God your best, you're showing contempt for him. You place defiled food on my altar, but you ask, how have we defiled you? By saying that the Lord's table is contemptible. When you bring blind animals for sacrifice, is that not wrong? When you sacrifice crippled or diseased animals, is that not wrong? Try offering them to your governor. I love that. Would he be pleased with you? Would he accept you? Says the Lord Almighty. You try passing this off as your tax bill, and it won't work. But it's okay, we'll give God whatever. This is a terrible habit. Again, I think most Christian workers that I've known give God their best. But there's a bunch out there that don't, and that's disgusting. There were a number of ways in which Israel showed contempt for God. One was they offered diseased animals as sacrifices. The second one was that they were embracing mixed marriages with heathen. We talked about this a moment ago. They were marrying Canaanites and other Gentiles who had not converted to Judaism. And as Ryrie pointed out, marry them, you marry their God. Ryrie wrote, heathen spouses brought foreign gods into Jewish homes and said, in effect, marry me, marry my religion. And young people, pay attention. You want to make sure when you get married, you marry a solid believer. Malachi chapter 2, verses 11 through 12. Judah has broken faith. A detestable thing has been committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. Judah has desecrated the sanctuary the Lord loves by marrying the daughter of a foreign god. As for the man who does this, whoever he may be, may the Lord cut him off from the tents of Jacob, even though he brings offerings to the Lord Almighty. God says, just get rid of that man. If this is going to be his attitude, he really shouldn't be part of the family of Israel. Again, number of ways in which Israel showed contempt for God. They offered diseased animals as sacrifices. They were embracing mixed marriages with heathens. And they were divorcing the wives of their youth. And this was particularly sad because not only was it a sin against God, and ultimately all sin is against God, but it was terrible for these women who were then often left destitute. Another thing you do, you flood the Lord's altar with tears. You flood the altar, Lord's, he's talking here about the lack of prosperity. They're offering sacrifices, sometimes disease, and then complaining because God wasn't blessing them with crops that were more abundant. You're flooding my altar with tears, but you're acting sinfully. This is his point. Another thing you do, you flood the Lord's altar with tears. You weep and wail because he no longer pays attention to your offerings or accepts them with pleasure from your hands. You ask why. It is because the Lord is acting as the witness between you and the wife of your youth, because you have broken faith with her, though she is your partner, the wife of your marriage covenant. I hate divorce, says the Lord God of Israel. I hate divorce. Number of ways the Israelites showed contempt for God. They offered diseased animals. They were embracing mixed marriages with heathens. They were divorcing the wives of their youth. And they were robbing God. Now, when I first got saved, I couldn't quite understand this robbing God business. And the reason God accused them of robbing him is because they weren't tithing 10%. I remember when I first got saved, I thought, well, why do you call that robbery? If they choose not to give you their 10% of the money they earned, that's not robbery. It's not like they're putting their hand in your pocket. They're just not putting their hands in their own pocket and giving you 10%. How does that read? If I don't give you money, 10% of my income, you can't accuse me of robbing you. Now, if I put my hand in your pocket, you can accuse me of robbery. Well, let me see, our whole attitude toward giving is not the way God's attitude is toward giving. God begins with this great truth. He owns everything. He owns it all. And the deal he's made with us is essentially this. I'm going to let you throw some of my seed into my soil, and I'm going to rain down some of my water on it, and then some of my sunlight's going to hit it, and then it's going to grow up, and I'm going to let you keep 90% of my crops. I'm going to let you keep 90% of the sheep, and 90% of the goats, and 90% of the cattle. But I'm not going to let you keep 10% of what belongs to me. So when you take my 10%, guess what you're doing? You're putting your hand in my pocket. You're robbing me. We think, oh, I don't give 10%. Uh, I'm just failing to be generous. I'm failing to give God some of my stuff. No, God says, you're keeping what belongs to me. Now, there's no command in the New Testament to give 10%. Let me add that. That was an Old Testament law. In the New Testament, the great theme of the epistles is that we give God everything. And then we take what we need. So actually, the demands on New Testament saints, while he doesn't lay it out in figures, the demand is greater. But the point he was making here was that God says, you're not tithing. This is that whole storehouse. His appeal is going to bring your tithes and your offerings into the storehouse of God. If you don't, for the Jews, you're robbing God because you're keeping his 10%. It isn't yours to give away. It all belongs to him. He's being very generous. Actually, he's being extremely generous. He lets us keep 90%. That's pretty good, isn't it? Don't complain. And if you don't, you're robbing. You're not just failing to be generous. See, we like to think about it. It's like people do horrible things, and then they say, well, I know I'm not perfect. Well, I know I made a mistake. No, you did something horrible. It's more than a mistake. It's wrong. So, they were offering diseased animals as sacrifices. They were embracing mixed marriages with heathens. They were divorcing the wives of their youth. They were robbing God. Let me read this passage from chapter 3. Will a man rob God, that you rob me? But you ask, how do we rob you? In tithes and offerings is his answer. You are under a curse, the whole nation of you, because you are robbing me. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that you will not have room enough for it. That should encourage us. Okay, they were robbing God, and the fifth way in which they showed contempt for God was they dismissed serving God as being pointless. And what was happening here is the same problem God's people probably had throughout history. In fact, there's a psalm, the 37th Psalm. It's the Fret Not Psalm. I don't know if many of you are familiar with this. The Fret Not, Fret Not, Fret. It's the Fret Not Psalm. The Fret Not Psalm was written by King David. And what the writer was fretting about was he looked around and he saw all the evil people doing well. He saw the wicked people thriving. And he looked at the righteous people and they weren't doing so well, and he fretted. And he looked at the evil, wicked, horrible people. They seemed to be healthier. They seemed to have more money. Their retirement policies were better. And he was fretting. And that, in a sense, is what was happening here. The Israelites were looking at some of their pagan neighbors, and many of them were wealthy. And they weren't serving God. They weren't offering God sacrifices. They looked at some of their Jewish neighbors, and their Jewish neighbors who were evil. They weren't obeying God's laws. They were making no attempts at living righteous lives. They were making no attempts at being religious, and they were thriving. And if we look at the world today, the richest people aren't the godly people. Have you noticed that? Now, some of you be more observant, I can tell you. If you go to Wall Street, I promise you, if you survey the richest people on Wall Street, a very small percentage are genuine believers. The simple fact is, God's people aren't the richest on the earth. So, let's go back to Israel. The Jews at the time of Malachi looked around and say, all these evil people seem to be doing so well. And us godly people who are trying to obey the law, God's law, live righteous lives, offer up sacrifices, we're not doing so well. So what's the point in serving God? I mean, if it doesn't work, if serving God doesn't result in an increase in the size of my bank account, what's the point? If that's your attitude, you got a problem. Unfortunately, this is the attitude some Christians have. They look around and say, well, I can't tell you the number of times problems come up in a couple's life or an individual's life. And I'll talk with the guy and he said, I did everything right. I went to church, I tithed, I raised my kids in Sunday school, but I still lost my job. What's the point? I have neighbors who don't give two hoots about God. They're doing all right. I serve the Lord, and I'm doing badly. And they get angry, and they walk away. Actually, I would say that I don't know this statistically, but my own personal observations, anecdotal, is that the number one reason why Christians walk away from the faith, I'm not saying they lose their salvation necessarily. Don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that once you're saved, you're going to stay saved forever. I believe in eternal security. But the reason, Christians who, no question, that you saw in church for 5 years, you don't see them anymore. They're going out living a pagan life. The number one reason I've found for folks walking away from the faith is disappointment with God. They go to church, they try to live a godly life, they do everything right, but they still have major problems. And they become disappointed with God and walk away. And in fact, when they do that, they're doing just what the Israelites did at the time of Malachi. They're saying, if we do live a righteous life and we serve God, and it doesn't work its way out in prosperity, what's the point? And that was the problem they were having here. Malachi 3, verses 13 through 15. You have said harsh things against me, says the Lord, that you ask, what have we said against you? You have said, it is futile to serve the Lord. What did we gain by carrying out his requirements and going about like mourners before the Lord Almighty? But now we call the arrogant blessed. The arrogant seem to be doing well. They're blessed. Certainly the evildoers prosper. Even those who challenge God escape. Not good. They looked around and said, there's no point in serving God. We don't get richer. We don't get healthier for it. So what's the point? To heck with it. So there were a number of ways the Israelites showed contempt for God. They offered diseased animals as sacrifices. They were embracing mixed marriages with heathens. They were divorcing the wives of their youth. They were robbing God. And they dismissed serving God as being pointless. If your whole idea is that serving God should result in prosperity, and if it doesn't come, it's pointless, then you've sort of missed out on what the Christian life is about. Okay, 3 very important issues raised in the book of Malachi. Israel had foolishly doubted God's love. Israel was guilty of spiritual apathy and contempt for God. And then there were a number of prophecies about the coming of John the Baptist. Malachi wrote about someone preparing the way for the Messiah. He didn't say it would be John the Baptist. He just said there are 2 places that someone would come and prepare the way for the Messiah. In one place, he called this someone a messenger. In another place, he called this someone Elijah. We'll read those passages. Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. See, I will send my messenger who will prepare the way before me. Then suddenly the Lord you are seeking will come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant whom you desire will come, says the Lord Almighty. And in chapter 4, verse 5, see, I will send you the prophet Elijah before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. These are the 2 passages in which he mentions that someone, Elijah and a messenger, will prepare the way for the coming Messiah. Now, let me just sort of summarize this. If you read, actually there are 8 different scriptural writers who write about someone preparing the way for the Messiah. 2 in the Old Testament, 6 in the New Testament. I say characters write and speak about someone preparing the way for the Messiah. And it can be a little bit confusing if you put them all together. So let me just sort of summarize. It's very easy to understand what he's talking about, but it's sort of difficult to understand how they put it all together. The subject's not difficult to understand, but in many ways it is described. The way it's described can be confusing. Jesus came the first time to die, and a man prepared the way who was John the Baptist. Jesus will come a second time to reign, and a man will prepare the way. We don't know his name, but he's called Elijah, and it may be actually the real Elijah coming back to earth to do it, or another man like John the Baptist coming in the strength and power of Elijah. Almost certainly one of the 2 witnesses that we read about in chapter 11. One of those, or maybe God counts both of them as someone preparing the way. At any event, this isn't hard to understand. Messiah's going to come twice, and on both occasions, someone who will come in the power of Elijah to prepare the way for the Messiah to come. Now, there's several, as I pointed out a moment ago, several biblical writers and characters who spoke about this one who would come and prepare the way. Isaiah spoke about him. Malachi wrote about him. Gabriel spoke about him. When Gabriel came to announced the birth of John the Baptist to his father Zechariah. Remember? His father was in the temple offering up incense, and the angel said he will come in the spirit and power of Elijah. He said, he also told him to name him John. Matthew wrote about it, Mark wrote about it, Luke wrote about it, John wrote about it, and Jesus wrote about it. So you have a number of writers writing about this one who will come and prepare the way for the Messiah. And they write about it a little bit differently. Malachi calls him a messenger. Malachi also calls him Elijah. And New Testament writers call him Elijah. And Jesus calls this one who will prepare the way Elijah. He's also called John the Baptist by the New Testament writers, and Jesus and Gabriel. And he's also called a voice of one calling in the desert, prepare the way for the Lord. Isaiah and Matthew and Mark and Luke call him that. And then Jesus suggested that he was one of the two witnesses of Revelation chapter 11. What I'm doing is just pointing out that it's a little bit more complex than that simple summary I gave you. The simple summary explains it all, but you'll find that he's called a messenger, Elijah, John the Baptist, a voice of one calling in the desert, prepare the way of the Lord. And he's probably one of the two witnesses of Revelation chapter 11. Jesus said, the disciples asked Jesus, why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? Jesus replied, to be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. Now, in this particular moment, and this is all part of the same answer, he's talking about one of those two witnesses. Some future, Elijah will come and will restore all things in preparation for the Messiah to come. This speaks of the one, and incidentally, Elijah, if you recall in the story of Elijah, he shut up the sky so that it didn't rain for 3.5 years. During the first 3.5 years of the tribulation, these two witnesses are going to shut up the sky so it doesn't rain for 3.5 years. There's a marvelous sameness there. So Jesus said, in fact, what he's in these verses here, he's simply pointing out verses 10 and 11 that Elijah will come and will prepare the way. But he's also going to point out immediately after this, Elijah has come. But I tell you, Elijah has already come. So he will come and he's already come. And it wasn't really Elijah, it was John the Baptist. This is talking about, it'd be a little confusing. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. So Jesus said, Elijah has come, John the Baptist, and Elijah will come, one of the two witnesses. Jesus came the first time to die, and a man prepared the way. Jesus will come a second time to reign, and a man will prepare the way. A final note from Warren Wiersbe. The last word in our English Old Testament is the word curse, Malachi 4:6. The last word. At the end of the New Testament we read, and there shall be no more curse. I love that. The last chapter, no more curse. So the Old Testament ends on the word curse, but the last chapter in the New Testament ends with there shall be no more curse. The difference? Jesus Christ. This ends our study of the Old Testament. You've been very patient. It's only taken us, 5 years? Anyway, Lord willing, next week we're going to start the life of Christ. And I'm not sure that we'll have the harmonies ready, but we will have the first set of notes ready. Lord willing, yes, Rich? He runs all these notes off. Let's hear it for Rich. And so, Lord willing, we'll start Life of Christ. And we are going to do it from a harmony. We haven't run the copies of the harmony off yet, but we're going to start with scene 1 in his life and then go right through. So, Lord willing, it won't take 7 years this time. For those of you here for the last marathon run, I'm going to rewrite the notes. So, hold on to your... What? I don't know. I don't think I'll live 7 more years, but we'll get as far as we can. Thank you. But I love this. I'm looking forward to it. I get a lot out of it. I mean, I felt like I've been in the New Testament long enough. I needed to see Jesus. So Lord willing, we'll see Jesus together. Okay? Father, we love you. We worship you. We thank you for being such a glorious and wonderful God. We're blessed to be able to call you our God. Thank you for that. I pray that you will continue to bless us for having looked at all these wonderful books in the Old Testament. And I pray that you'll bless our study of the life of Christ in the New Testament. All these things we ask in Jesus' precious name. Amen.